Mark Howery, thank you for joining us at the Sam Noble Museum to participate in a Q&A covering a wide range of topics involving birds. But first, would you mind sharing a bit about yourself and what you do?
Okay, well, my name is Mark Howery, and I'm a biologist for the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation. And specifically, I'm what we call a wildlife diversity or a non-game biologist. So I'm a biologist that works with those animal species that are not hunted or angled here in the state. So it includes birds, but it's also amphibians, reptiles, some insect groups, and also small mammals. But birds is really my main background, and my master's work was in ornithology. I worked on loggerhead shrikes, territorial behavior and foraging behavior of that particular bird. And then in addition to being a biologist for the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation, I'm also president of the Cleveland County Audubon Society, and I'm also the conservation chair for the Oklahoma Ornithological Society, which is it's an interesting mix of professional and amateur birders and ornithologists, people that share an interest in the study of birds here in Oklahoma.
What initially sparked your interest in birds?
So, my interest in birds goes way back. I mean, I don't even think I can remember a time when I wasn't interested in birds. I think, because birds are active in the daytime when people are, it's a group of animals that people see all the time and relate to. So, I've been seeing birds and essentially watching birds all my life, or a good portion of it. I know that I had a pretty strong interest by third grade in birds, and I got my first pair of binoculars for Christmas in sixth grade. And so since then, I was looking at birds. And even before then, I guess I was looking at birds at bird feeders. So I would say that my initial years of looking at birds was in the wintertime, because we had a bird feeder. Lots of people I knew kept bird feeders. And so I got to learn the winter birds. And then over time, I picked up the summer birds, and then later the migrant species that come through in the spring and in the fall.
Was there a specific moment in your life that led you to studying birds in a graduate program?
There must have been. It's been so long now, I don't recall. But when I went into college, I knew I wanted to get a degree in zoology. I mean, I knew that from the beginning, and I didn't necessarily. I guess my interests were in birds, but I didn't necessarily limit myself to birds. So I tried to learn all the animal groups. I tried to learn everything I could when I was an undergraduate. And then probably by my sophomore year, I realized that what I wanted to do was to go a little bit beyond that and go and pursue graduate school. And so I knew the last 3 years that I was in college that I also wanted to go to graduate school. And birds was just my logical choice, because I had such a long history with birds by that point, or at least in a relative sense. Most of my life up to that point had been engaged with birds. So, I don't know how that answers the question well, but I had a long history with birds, and so there was not a time that I thought about going to school for anything other than a zoology degree, or graduate school for anything other than ornithology, or at least a project related to birds.
Could you highlight a few bird species that are unique to Oklahoma?
Okay, so here in Oklahoma, we're kind of an area where east meets west. So we have a lot of eastern specialties and a lot of western birds that just kind of hit the eastern edge of their range in our state. But there are a few birds that really hit their peak abundance in the south central U.S. So one of them is the painted bunting, which I think some people are familiar with. It's a bright, colorful, small songbird that's here in the summer months. They usually show up in mid-April and then migrate back south to Mexico and Central America in late September, early October. Another specialty is the scissor-tailed flycatcher, our state bird. Oklahoma and Texas accounts for about 90% of that bird's breeding range. And so it's a specialty bird that you really can only find in a handful of states in this country. And then another one is the Harris's sparrow. It's a winter bird. So the The scissor-tail flycatcher is just here during the summer months, April through October. The Harris's sparrow is kind of the opposite. The Harris's sparrow breeds up in Hudson Bay and in the Arctic, up in the sort of central Canadian Arctic. And then they come down here for the winter. So we'll start seeing Harris's sparrows toward the end of October, and they'll stay around till about the first week of May before they migrate back north. And then a fourth one that I'll mention is the Smith's longspur. It's a grassland bird that is here during the winter months. It again is another Arctic tundra bird in the summertime. Then the population comes down into Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas for the winter. And so we're one of just a handful of states where people can see Smith's longspurs as well. They're a grassland specialist, and so their habitats are very specific. They like mixed grass prairie and tall grass prairie, and they like disturbed grasslands within that, especially grasslands that have wiregrass in them. And so not just every grassland has Smith's longspurs, it's very specific locations. But anyway, those four are probably I would say the four quintessential, unique birds to the South Central Plains. Though we have, 385 species of birds that occur in Oklahoma at some point in the year. So there are many more than those four to see.
How do you conduct field studies on local bird populations, and what does that process look like?
Okay, well, it kind of varies with the season, but I'll say when we're doing bird work in the summertime, I'm engaged in several monitoring projects, like the Breeding Bird Survey. And so those surveys are typically done as much by sound as they are by sight. So I'll go to a specific location, and for either 3 minutes or 5 minutes or 8 minutes, depending upon the situation, I'll record every bird that I see or hear. But in the summertime, about 80% of the birds I detect are detected by sound. I may not even see them. There is a national program called the Breeding Bird Survey that's done by both professional biologists and amateur birders. There's about 1,200 routes scattered around the country. There's almost 50 routes here in Oklahoma, and I do 2 of those routes. And there you have a route that has 50 stops. We start a little before sunrise, try to finish by 10:30 in the morning, and spend 3 minutes at each stop recording every bird that is seen or heard. And that gives us kind of a baseline condition for comparison year after year after year. So that's typically how we're done in the summertime. We'll do point counts or a breeding bird survey route. In the wintertime, it's a little different. Birds aren't as vocal. They tend to be clustered in flocks more in the wintertime. And so there we rely on a technique known as a time search, where you're either driving or walking through a field, either along a road or walking along a transect, counting birds over a specific length of time. So an example of that would be the Christmas bird count. It's there we record both the length of time that we're out in the field and the mileage that we cover on foot or by car. And then we can scale the birds to a metric of either miles or a metric of time. But that's how we do those kind of studies. Of course, there's many other ways to study birds. There are many people that look at nest success. So they will spend a lot of time, invest a lot of time trying to find bird nests and then monitor those nests to determine their outcome. That's a real labor-intensive kind of a project. I don't get involved in those. But there are many people that do, and my agency has supported a number of studies over the years looking at nest success of birds. Another way of looking at birds is to band birds and track them through migration. And there are ornithologists that put a lot of time into putting out mist nets to capture birds, or putting drop door traps down to capture birds, and then they band them and then try to relocate them at some future date. That way you can get information on the distance that they travel, the migration corridors that they move along, and also the longevity of the birds. And it can be for small songbirds, it can be for game birds like mourning doves or waterfowl, and it can be done for some of the endangered birds like whooping cranes. There are here in recent years, with all of the GPS tracking and satellite tracking devices, some of the larger birds, they can actually put satellite transmitters on them and track them over time. And that's being done with, in Oklahoma, it's being done with whooping cranes, and other parts of the country, it's being done with shorebirds, it's being done with California condors. So you have this great opportunity to track the movements of birds. My counterparts in North Dakota are involved in a project tracking long-billed curlews, and they put satellite transmitters on curlews to figure out, when they leave the nesting grounds, where they go for the winter, and then when they return to the nesting grounds the following year, and whether the birds are going to the same places in the winter and the same places in the summertime. And plus you get information on longevity, so you get an idea of what percentage of those birds die during migration or during the winter or during the summer. So many ways to study birds, but I'm more involved in surveys, so that tends to be point counts or time searches.
Could you share some information about the primary habitats for birds in Oklahoma?
Okay, well, and that's actually a tough question, because birds occupy every habitat type here in Oklahoma. So there's not a place in Oklahoma that doesn't have birds. I will say there are places that have more birds than others, or that are special to specific birds. So I guess I'll go down that road. So there are several habitat types that are more valuable, quote unquote valuable to birds than others, but just know that birds are in every habitat type. There's not a habitat that's devoid of birds. But in general, you'll see your highest bird diversity in forested habitats, so bottomland forests, riparian forests along streams and creeks and river floodplains, and then also the mesic deciduous forests that we have in the Ozarks and on those north-facing slopes of the Ouachita Mountains. Those tend to have the greatest diversity of birds in terms of numbers, and they're important to birds like cerulean warblers, Swainson's warblers, hooded warbler, Acadian flycatcher, very, very specialized birds. Then you have some habitats that are important to specific groups of birds. So tallgrass prairie as a habitat type is really important to a group of tallgrass specialist birds. There aren't as many species there, or as many individual birds as what you'd find in a forested habitat, but those birds that are there are very dependent upon that habitat. So things like dickcissel, grasshopper sparrow, Henslow sparrow, greater prairie chicken, they're all dependent upon tallgrass prairie habitat. The shortgrass prairie is another good example of that. The diversity of birds in shortgrass prairie is fairly low, but the birds that are there are unique to that habitat type. So shortgrass prairie is really important to Cassin sparrow. It's really important to long-billed curlew. It's very important to mountain plover, burrowing owl, ferruginous hawk, Swainson's hawk. So they're important. I guess if we want to just generalize it, I would say that forests in general are very important, and prairies in general are very important. They're important for different groups of birds, but they're our most important habitat types. But then there are lots of little pockets of places that are also important. So the Wichita Mountains, for example, is a great pocket. It's kind of one of those east meets west places where you've got grasslands, but you also have those wooded or shrubby hillsides that are important to birds like painted buntings and a bird called the black-capped vireo that up until a few years ago was considered an endangered species. Its populations have been increasing to the point where it was removed from the endangered species list, but it's still an uncommon bird. Our whole population in Oklahoma is probably not more than about 5,000 birds, so it's still pretty rare. And then in the southeastern part of the state, you've got some pine woodlands, open pine woodlands in the Ouachita Mountains that are important to another set of birds. So the endangered red-cockaded woodpecker is found only in open pine woodlands, and then occurring with them with that species are some other rare species like the Bachman sparrow and the brown-headed nuthatch and the prairie warbler. These are all dependent upon kind of open pine systems, open pine woodlands.
What are some of the biggest threats to bird habitats, and what are we doing to protect them here in Oklahoma?
Well, gosh. Well, see, the biggest threat to all wildlife, not just birds, but all wildlife, is habitat loss and habitat alteration. So the chopping up of habitats into smaller parcels that are isolated or changed in some way affects bird populations. The conversion of habitat from one type to another, so from forest to grassland, or from grassland to cropland, or from forest to residential neighborhood, those kind of changes that alter the habitat, that really is the number one driver for the declines that we see in wildlife, or increases in wildlife too, depending upon the species. Not everything is in decline, but I'd say many animals are in kind of a slow, steady decline. So I guess there's a kind of a multi-pronged approach to conserving habitat. So one of them is through acquisition for conservation purposes. So ODWC has purchased several properties over the years that we manage as wildlife management areas. So it's to protect that. And we do it for wildlife, but what we're really doing is protecting the habitat that those wildlife species depend upon. Another is conservation easements, and there are several organizations that have conservation easements. The Nature Conservancy, the Natural Resource Conservation Service has that. And then there's several entities that have outreach and landowner assistance programs. So we have a couple of private lands biologists that work with private landowners and have cost share grants with them to improve habitat conditions on their property. So to take a woodland that is in poor condition and improve the condition of it, or take a grassland that has a lot of invasive species and try to shift the balance by eliminating the invasives and bringing back more of the native species to increase the quality of that grassland habitat. So that's land acquisition, conservation easements, and then technical assistance, as well as grants to landowners, or cost share grants to landowners to help them improve habitats, are three of the things that are being done in our state and actually all around the country to benefit birds.
When looking at migratory routes of birds, would it be fair to say that the decline in their habitat is something like losing access to their preferred hotels and gas stations when traveling?
I guess you could say that. I mean, for a migrating bird, that loss of habitat, if habitat gets chopped up and converted to other uses that are less conducive to birds, they've got fewer places to land and to refuel, to find food during their migration. As nesting birds, they've got fewer places to nest. Another thing to think about is that not just any small tract of land will support birds. For example, you could have a great 1 acre tract of forest or a great 2 acre tract of prairie, but that's really not enough to support a nesting population of most of our bird species. Most of our birds need tracts of land that are 40 acres, 120 acres, 400 acres. It kind of depends upon the species, but little pockets don't do much for breeding birds. It really takes bigger landscapes, because that's how those birds have lived their lives for thousands of years. They have operated on a landscape scale, not so much on the little parcel scale. But parcels can be beneficial to migratory birds, because every little piece gives them a place to stop over and to find food during their migration. But as habitat is converted to other uses, yes, the number of stopover places diminishes. The number of places where birds can settle to raise chicks and raise their families also diminishes.
What are some of the difficulties that a bird migrating through the Central Flyway might experience?
I can't even enumerate all of them, but one of the difficulties is finding places that have food. So there may be a place that looks good, but it may not have food. It may have poor food resources, but just look good. So that's one thing, is birds wasting time and energy going to unproductive spots. That's one possibility. Another is that the good sites might be so far apart that well, I don't know how to best describe this because I can't combine all the birds into one average bird. They're all so different. But let's say a sandpiper, for example. A young sandpiper has got to navigate that route and recognize what is good habitat, what is suitable habitat. And whereas an adult bird has a better understanding of what's likely to be good. And not that adult birds don't make mistakes, but they've got a better read for where good habitat is than young birds do. And they have a better understanding of how far it is between habitat patches. So for a shorebird, a lot of them are hopping from river system to river system. So a sandpiper or a crane might be going from the Missouri River to the Platte River to the Arkansas River to the Red River to the coast. And an adult bird kind of has a gauge based on their experience as to how long those stops are, how long it's going to need to fly, whereas a young bird doesn't know that. They're having to learn that by following the lead of other birds or just learn it on their own. In the case of sandpipers, a lot of the times the adult birds migrate south before the young do. And so those young birds are navigating mostly by instinct for the first time as they go south in the spring, or they go south in the fall and back north in the spring. Another hazard that birds face are collisions, obstacles that have been put in their way. So if we think about songbirds, they do a lot of their migration based on star patterns, this sort of instinct. They have this instinct ability to read star patterns and use that as a guide to get them north and south in the spring and in the fall. And when we have cloudy weather, they lose that navigation tool, and sometimes birds will get confused and they will see human-created lights from buildings or street lights or radio antenna, something like that, and they will gravitate to that light thinking it's a star. They'll sort of reorient to it. And one problem that birds have is in our cities, in migration, on a clear night, the birds are migrating with star patterns, and they just, for the most part, go right over our cities with little incidents. But on a cloudy night, they'll be attracted to the city lights because they don't have a star pattern to follow. They'll get confused and they'll start orienting around a city and they'll around, say, a tall building. And so they may come into a metropolitan area and then just start flying around buildings, all through the night until the sun comes up and they fly off or they settle in for the day. So buildings create a hazard for them. I'll just say that. And it doesn't mean that the birds are crashing into the buildings. What most of them are doing is flying around a building, and then they are hitting other objects, hitting power lines or hitting trees around that and getting killed that way. And then sometimes birds get physically exhausted from flying and they'll land on the ground, and then the next morning the sun will come up. They'll take off to go look for food, and windows that are highly reflective will look like the sky or look like trees, and then the birds fly into them. So birds aren't flying into buildings at night. They're actually flying into the buildings the next morning when they're getting up to go after roosting, which is one reason that, ironically, the buildings that have trees around them are sometimes the most problematic for migrating birds, because the birds are going to those trees to roost and then accidentally hitting a building later. And there's been quite a bit of research on window collisions. Most window collisions happen in the bottom 3 or 4 stories of buildings. They're not hitting the 50th floor, and most of them are down low. So that's one collision, or collisions is one obstacle for them. We have this proliferation of windmills that are coming up, and that's a new hazard for birds. Birds will get hit by windmill blades as they're migrating past. I don't want to say that that's killing, billions of birds. It's not, but it's having an effect. Everybody's heard the term death by 1,000 cuts. Well, that happens with birds and with wildlife. There's a lot of things there. So they're dealing with predators. They're dealing with storm events during migration. They're dealing with new hazards like buildings, windmills, utility lines. All of those are new hazards, and then habitat loss on top of that. So there's a lot of things working against them that they have to navigate successfully to make a successful north or south migration.
In your field surveys, have you noticed a decline in birds?
Well, I have noticed declines in specific species, not in bird communities overall, but in specific species. So I've been doing the breeding bird survey. I've been a volunteer for the breeding bird survey for almost 30 years now, and I have noticed a decline in yellow-billed cuckoo. That's one that's very prominent in my estimation. And then I've noticed a few other declines that I think are really based more on habitat changes. So in the routes that I cover, there have been declines in field sparrows, eastern meadowlarks, northern bobwhite quail. The bobwhite is not a migrant, and the field sparrow is a very short distant migrant. So those declines really don't have anything to do with migration losses. It really is habitat change. The areas there that I'm looking at in central Oklahoma, they're facing other factors. So part of it is human development, so more houses kind of chopping up the landscape. Another thing is a lot of our grasslands that we have are being invaded by exotic species. So what used to be prairies are becoming more and more dominated by Bermuda grass, which is an exotic species, Johnson grass, another exotic species, and tall fescue, which may be the worst of the three. All three are pretty bad from a bird perspective. So the character of our grasslands are changing. And then some of our grasslands are getting more shrubby and more brushy. So they're not really grasslands as much as they are shrublands now. So I think in the case of quail and in the case of field sparrow and eastern meadowlark, those declines are really a grassland-focused change in quality. Those grasslands are getting brushier, and they're getting invaded by more invasive species that don't have the same food resources that our native grasses have. They don't produce the same amount of food. They don't support the same insect populations. So the whole food base changes for those birds.
Are there any particular birds that you're most worried about?
Well, I guess there are some birds that I'm worried about, not to the point that I think they're endangered, but they're just on a bad trajectory, a poor trajectory. So the ones I just mentioned, field sparrow, eastern meadowlark, yellow-billed cuckoo, Bell's vireo, northern bobwhite, those are all in kind of a worrisome trajectory because they have long-term, slow, steady declines that are indicative of habitat loss. There's a few birds that I'm not particularly worried about. We have some that are doing quite well or have been increasing. So northern cardinal has been on the increase. Tufted titmouse has been on the increase. Carolina wrens have generally been increasing. So we have increasers and we have decreasers. But for our part of the world, here in Oklahoma, our biggest decreasers tend to be the grassland birds and also the migrants relative to the resident birds. And part of it is that resident birds have, most of them have a longer breeding season. So for example, cardinals, they're residents, they're here year round. And a pair of cardinals can raise 3 broods of chicks in a year. So, they have ample opportunities to replace themselves and to build their population. A lot of our migrant birds only raise 1 brood of chicks a year. Or maybe they'll get in a second brood if the weather conditions are really good. If we have a nice wet June and a wet July, they might be able to raise a second brood. But their breeding period is shorter because they don't come up here until April, so they can't really start nesting until the middle or latter part of April. And then they've got to fatten up and get ready to migrate south. And many of them leave here in late August or in September. So they have a smaller window of time in which to breed. And so they're more vulnerable to, I think, population declines. I think that's one reason that yellow-billed cuckoo is declining. They only raise 1 brood of chicks a year. They only lay 3 eggs in a clutch, so they don't have a lot of, they don't have a lot of opportunities. If they have a string of bad years, it can really put a damper on their population. Like I said, with 300 species, 300 plus species, they're all doing different things. So they're not all declining, they're not all increasing. They all have different habitat needs. And it's hard to think about, well, this is happening with hawks, this is happening with grassland songbirds, this is happening with shorebirds. They're all kind of affected in different ways.
Keep track of it all.
I don't keep track of all of it, but I just tried my best to keep track of it. The nice thing about that breeding bird survey route is that it covers lots of species. It gives you relative abundance for, the majority of our breeding birds. It doesn't do colonial birds well, because colonial birds are so spotty. But for birds that are territorial and it exists as pairs, the breeding bird surveys are really good survey tool. I don't know what percentage of our birds are adequately monitored by the breeding bird survey, but I feel like it's around 70% of our breeding birds, at least in Oklahoma, that are surveyed well by the breeding bird survey.
What are some ongoing or upcoming projects at the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation that are aimed at supporting bird populations?
At supporting bird populations. Okay, well, there are several things going on, and some of them are going to be somewhat repetitious to what I've talked about in the past. But I'll just start with some species-specific work. So we do some things that are species-specific, and we do other things that are habitat-based. So on a species-specific level, those projects tend to be directed towards birds in particular decline. So one of our birds that's in decline and is rare is the red-cockaded woodpecker. And the only population of red-cockaded woodpeckers in Oklahoma occurs in a small area in McCurtain County in southeastern Oklahoma on property that's owned by the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation and a little bit of property that's owned by the U.S. Forest Service. And so ODWC and the U.S. Forest Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service have been involved in I guess it's now a 32-year effort to improve habitat conditions for red-cockaded woodpecker. So we've been instituting prescribed burns to try to improve habitat and make it more open. They feed on grasshoppers and katydids that need a good herbaceous understory. And so introducing periodic fire during the winter months helps to open the tree canopy and helps to improve herbaceous vegetation that the insects need. So that provides more of a food base for the woodpeckers to build their population. Then we have several things that are habitat-based. So we have this landowner incentive program, or actually it's a wildlife habitat improvement program that has cost share grants to landowners to improve habitat. So it's helping to create like fence riparian areas to help restore riparian woodlands. It can be overseeding pastures with native grass seed to try to diversify the habitat base. There's a project that we're working on in conjunction with the Oaks and Prairies Joint Venture, which is a habitat-based bird conservation organization. They have a program called their GRIP program. It's Grassland Improvement Program. And they provide cost share funding to landowners to institute prescribed burning and to do overseeding of native grasses and native forbs to improve grassland quality for grassland birds. So those are one. We also have a few research projects, and so there's kind of that line between, what is a conservation program, what is a research program. Our research informs conservation programs, so they're kind of like an important arm of a conservation program. We have a research project going on right now looking at wild turkey populations, because wild turkey numbers in this state increased pretty steadily from the 50s into the early 2000s. And then here in the last 15 years, we've seen declines now in a lot of the state. And so we're trying to get at what has happened here in the last 15 years. It has taken that has turned the trajectory on wild turkeys that were slowly increasing. Now they're slowly decreasing. So trying to figure that out. So there's not so much a conservation program now, but that research will inform conservation programs in the future to try to figure out what is needed to improve turkey populations. So those are examples. We've have wrapped up this project, but we, for a number of years, were partners with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in a black cat vireo project. The black cat vireo was an endangered species up until 2018, I think it was, when it was delisted. And so when it was an endangered species, we had several programs out there to try to increase nest success and increase habitat quality, and they were successful. The population in Oklahoma grew from roughly 60 pairs to approximately 2,000 pairs now. So it was a successful program, kind of it was habitat based, but focused on black cat vireo habitat. So like I said, some of ours is single species focused, some of it is more broad habitat focused, but ultimately habitat is the key, because the quality and quantity of habitat is what ultimately decides what the carrying capacity is for each species and what their population sizes are going to be.
Looking forward, what are some of the most important steps needed to ensure the preservation of bird populations in Oklahoma?
Okay, well, I think maybe the number one step is protection of habitat in some way. And in Oklahoma, that's really going to depend upon cooperation and the buy-in of landowners, because in Oklahoma, about 96% of our landscape is privately owned. And so private landowners really hold the keys to success for most of our wildlife populations. So government agencies like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and ODWC and the Forest Service, we can protect pieces of it, and we do protect some very important areas, but the bulk of wildlife don't occur on ODWC's wildlife management areas or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's national wildlife refuges. Most of them occur on private property. So having private property owners that are interested in wildlife and interested in habitat and willing to manage for habitat, I think is kind of the key. And then finding ways to kind of goes hand in hand with this, is finding ways to make the landscape work for people as well. So there's the Natural Resource Conservation Service for 15 or 20 years now has had this Working Lands for Wildlife program. So it's trying to find that balance between making a ranch or a farm economically viable for people, but still provide habitat for wildlife or some subset of wildlife. So finding those balances, having receptive landowners or interested landowners that are not only landowners but also good stewards of the land that they own is important going forward. I think that in kind of a nutshell. I mean, and that takes so many different dimensions, because in some places that's ranching dependent, in other places that's forestry dependent. So it's going to change depending upon where you are in Oklahoma. But habitat at the end of the day is the number one driver. There are some other things that are pieces of it, like what actions can we take to maintain corridors of habitat that allow wildlife to move from one place to another is important. Birds are a little more forgiving, of landscape changes, even though we see these documented declines in birds. Birds are much more mobile than most animal species are. And so you can imagine, as the habitat is getting chopped up and it's affecting birds, it's also affecting rodents, it's affecting bats, it's affecting reptiles, it's affecting amphibians, fish, the whole ecosystem, even plants are being affected by it. So, yeah. And there's other ways to approach that question. I'm sure somebody else could answer it a different way. That's just my off-the-cuff take on it.
Okay, this is a bit of a side question. Are you a bird watcher?
I would say I'm a bird watcher. So bird watchers, we call ourselves birders now. I think that's been kind of like a trend. We've moved from bird watching to birders, but I would consider myself a birder. I'd also consider myself an ornithologist, so someone who studies birds. So I'm kind of both of those. But yeah, I was a birder or a bird watcher long before I was an ornithologist. And I don't know, I guess the two sort of mesh together in my life, but if I had to choose one or the other, I'm probably a birder at heart, just because I've been doing it longer. So.
What are some of the most popular birdwatching spots in Oklahoma? Additionally, what can visitors expect to see during different seasons?
Well, some of the best, some of it is there are lots of great places to see birds, but some places have that great combination of good facilities, a long history of birds so people know what to expect there, and easy accessibility and interesting birds. So kind of where those things all come together. So one of the great places to find birds in Oklahoma is up at Salt Plains National Wildlife Refuge up in northwestern Oklahoma. It's a hot spot for shorebirds during migration. It's a natural salt flat on the shore of a man-made lake. And then it has some grassland habitats and some riparian habitats on it. And because of that juxtaposition of habitat types, and because it's been present there for eons, that salt flat has been there for a long time, it's become a traditional migration stopover for sandpipers and for cranes. So it's a great place in the spring and the fall to see sandhill cranes, whooping cranes, a whole myriad of shorebirds, about 20 species of shorebirds, about 15 species of waterfowl. Eagles are up there. There's riparian songbirds that are there. So it's a really good spot. Another great spot for finding birds is Red Slough Wildlife Management Area down in the southeast part of the state in McCurtain County near the town of Idabel. It's actually a little bit south and east of Idabel. And there you've got tremendous wetland units. It's a wetland restoration area, and it attracts a lot of wading birds like herons, egrets, and ibises. So it's a great place to see those. It has some marsh birds like purple gallinule and common gallinule, a lot of waterfowl, and it has a lot of forest birds because it's a series of marshes surrounded by forest habitat. So you have things like, or birds like the prothonotary warbler, the pine warbler, the yellow-throated warbler that people like to see. So it's another good birding spot. The Wichita Mountains is another great place for birds because there you can get some eastern birds like summer tanager and indigo bunting and white-eyed vireo, and you get some western birds like rufous crowned sparrow, in the wintertime Harris's sparrow, lark sparrows. And then you have the kind of unique shrubland community birds like the black-capped vireo we talked about earlier. That's a former endangered species. Its hot spot in Oklahoma is in the Wichita Mountains, and painted buntings have a hot spot in the Wichita Mountains as well. So a lot of great songbirds that you can see there. And then another place in southwestern Oklahoma is Hackberry Flat Wildlife Management Area. It's another wetland restoration project that's been ongoing since the mid-90s. And in a dry period, it can be kind of dull, when the wetlands are dry. But when it's wet, and when we have a wet cycle, just birds stop in there by the thousands. And so it's a great stopover place for migrating shorebirds. A lot of birds will breed there that don't breed anywhere else in southwestern Oklahoma. So it can be great, but it's a place to kind of watch the weather conditions. When it's wetter, it's better. You could say that for all of those places. Wichita Mountains, it typically is better when it's wet. Salt Plains is better when it's wet. So I think those are, four really good places to see birds. There are many others. The Ouachita National Forest in Leflore County and McCurtain County in southeast Oklahoma. That's a great place to see songbirds. So I love it. If you're in the Oklahoma City area, we have Lake Thunderbird, which is a great bird watching area. Draper Lake, which is another really good bird watching area. So we have a variety of places across the state. And I can't really say that I have a favorite because they're all kind of unique in their own way. You know, each part of the state has a unique bird community, so there's something special to see just about everywhere you go in the state.
All right, last question. Do you have an all-time favorite bird?
I'm gonna say my all-time favorite bird is probably the white-eyed vireo. I love its call. It's just it's a colorful bird. I just like it. And it's hard for me to narrow it down to one, because if you ask me tomorrow, it might be a different bird. But I have about 150 favorite birds, but I'll say white-eyed vireo is my favorite. But just know that there are many, many runners up. There are many, many very close seconds.